Good morning and happy Valentine's Day from Mishkan Katan. We're so glad you're here joining us. As we gather today, we are finishing up our study on the appearances of Yeshua in the Tanakh, or of Jesus in the Old Testament. And we have a lot of ground to cover in covering appearances 24, 25, and 26. So without any further hesitation, let's jump into it today. We are going to be reading in Daniel chapter 3. So if you want to go ahead and turn there in your copy of the scriptures, you'll be a little bit ahead of the game. This is the famous story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their Babylonian names, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in Hebrew. Those three friends of Daniel are the ones who were cast into the fiery furnace by King Nebuchadnezzar, who inadvertently correctly identified the Malach Yahweh. We're taking up the story at the point where Nebuchadnezzar is threatening this trio of heroes with certain death. Let's begin reading in the latter part of verse 15 of chapter 3, and this is Nebuchadnezzar speaking. And what God is there who can rescue out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king. O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to answer you on this point. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and his facial expression changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then he gave a command that the furnace was to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. He commanded certain strong men in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these 3 men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their turbans, and their other clothes, and were thrown into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was extremely hot, the flame of the fire killed the men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. And here we have inserted in some translations of scriptures the prayer of Azariah, but I'm not going to comment on that any further right now. Let's go on to verse 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king looked and was astounded, and he jumped up and said to his counselors, "Did we not throw 3 men who were tied up into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He answered, "Look, I see 4 men untied, walking around in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar approached the door of the blazing furnace and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out of there, come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered around them and saw that in regard to these men, the fire had no effect on their bodies. Their hair was not singed, their clothes were not scorched or damaged, and even the smell of smoke was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants who believed in, trusted in, and relied on him." They violated the king's command and surrendered their bodies rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And that's the end of our scripture reading for this appearance from the Amplified Bible. Now, depending on the translation, Nebuchadnezzar identified this fourth man as a son of the gods, as it appears here in this translation, or an angel. Looking at commentaries, there's a good bit of debate as to who this divine being actually was. When listening to Nebuchadnezzar's words, we must understand that he was speaking from his polytheistic framework. So his calling the divine being a son of the gods does not preclude that personage actually being the Malach Yahweh, the Son of God. Nebuchadnezzar recognized that this fourth man, who did not come out of the fiery furnace with the trio of Daniel's friends, looked to be more than human. Nor can we discount the identity being the Malach Yahweh, the messenger of Yahweh, because Neb called him Yahweh's angel, as the Malach Yahweh is God's highest messenger. Remember, the meaning of the Hebrew word malach is messenger. No smell of smoke. I love that phrase. Years ago, I did a Bible study on Daniel via video with the now controversial Beth Moore. She told the story of how she went with her friends to a Mexican restaurant and ordered fajitas. When she got home, the smoke from the fajitas clung to her hair, her clothes. She definitely had a smell of smoke about her. But not these guys from the fiery furnace. No singe, no scorch, not even a smoky smell. Complete and total deliverance. One additional tidbit on this scene. The Malach Yahweh was the fourth man in the fiery furnace. In the Hebrew language, the letter of the alphabet with the numerical value of 4 is the letter Dalet, which looks like a door on a hinge, and which has connoted door to Hebrew speakers over the centuries. You might say that the Malach Yahweh was the door to the deliverance of these three men. Also, in John 10:9, Yeshua said, "I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture." I learned something. Well, I learned more than one something in the preparation of this teaching. But one thing that I learned was that between verses 23 and 24 above was, in some translations, something called the prayer of Azariah. This 22-verse prayer was present in the Greek translation of the Bible called the Septuagint, which was finished in the last century BCE, the century at the end of which Yeshua was born. These verses do not appear, however, in the oldest Hebrew manuscripts that are known today. Therefore, it is theorized that they were added by the 72 Greek Jewish scholars who made the Septuagint translation. And that's why some translations don't include them. You can still find this plea for deliverance and this tribute to the might of Yahweh in the Catholic Bible, but you won't find it in the Protestant translations, which, me being raised as a Protestant, that is probably why I was unfamiliar with it. I'm not going to read it this morning for the sake of time, but if you want to read it, just Google Prayer of Azariah. A hymn of praise called Song of the Three Young Men follows the prayer of Azariah in Catholic translations. I only mention this because I thought it was interesting. I could find nothing unorthodox or heretical about either of these pieces of poetry, but since neither appear in the original Hebrew sources, I agree with rejecting them as inspired scripture. Now, interestingly, Isaiah prophesied that Yahweh would be with his people during their upcoming exile to Babylon, the very time period in which the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego took place. Look at Isaiah 43:2. You don't have to turn there. I'll just read it to you. It's just one verse. And this is from the scriptures, ISR 1998. When you pass through the waters, I am with you. And through rivers, they do not overflow you. When you walk through fire, you are not scorched, and a flame does not burn you. Some scholars believe that Isaiah 43 was written about midway through the Babylonian exile, which would mean that it would have been written probably after the fiery furnace incident. Daniel and his friends were in their teens when they were tried and tested by the Babylonian king. They would not have been middle-aged or more in the fiery furnace. So it's likely Isaiah had heard of the incident and was praising Yahweh for his deliverance and testifying to his greatness with this miracle in mind. Other commentators, such as Matthew Henry, believe that the fiery furnace incident was a fulfillment of the prophecy in verse 2. Regardless of how you look at it, it's miraculous and wonderful. I love to find these connections between various books of the Bible and various passages in the Bible. Now we're going to move on to appearance number 25, but we're still in the book of Daniel. So many people have asked the question, where was Daniel when his friends were in the furnace of intense fire? Some commentators have pointed out that Daniel may have been otherwise occupied on Babylonian kingdom business, and that he likely did not find out about this incident until after it had happened. He was a very busy man, and later on in today's teaching, I'll touch on his many responsibilities, the magnitude of his position of power. So likely he was in another part of the kingdom when this happened. Whatever the case, if Father Yahweh had wanted Daniel involved in that fiery furnace incident, no doubt he would have been right up in the middle of it. And one thing I love about that story is that Daniel was a big wig. He was a BMOG, a BMOC, as we used to say, a big man on campus. Okay, when I was in college, we used to say that. Some of you who went to college with me, you recognized that, didn't you? At any rate, the story, though, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego took three otherwise unknown young men who were merely devout followers of Yahweh, and God showed up and showed out for them to glorify his name and to highlight their devotion to him. They were willing to become martyrs to the very end. Love that story. Okay, so we're going to talk about appearance 25 now. And so 3 chapters later, in Daniel 6, the monarchy has now changed. Nebuchadnezzar is no longer king. Between chapters 3 and chapter 6 in Daniel, the Persians and the Medes have overthrown the Babylonian Empire. And we find the great prophet Daniel involved in a testing situation of his own. Let's read beginning in verse 1 of chapter 6. And as we read these verses, I will stop and comment along the way. If You got your copy of the scriptures? I'm reading this morning again from the Scriptures 1998 ISR. It's a translation from the original Aramaic. It pleased Darius, now that's how they say Darius in Aramaic, something like that. It pleased Darius to appoint over the reign 120 viceroys, in some versions it says satraps, to be over all the reign, and over them 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, so that these viceroys should give account to them, and the sovereign suffer no loss, the sovereign being the king. Now, there's more than one Darius in the Old Testament. There are, in fact, 3. There are also 3 King Ahasueruses, and they all lived within just a very few decades of each other. So it can get very confusing. For today, we're going to focus on the 2 characters close at hand for appearances 25 and 26, our last 2 appearances. The Darius in this first appearance 25, is called Darius the Mede. He was the uncle of King Cyrus, and he was appointed by him to govern Babylon. He only reigned, however, for 2 years, and he reigned concurrently with King Cyrus, who was the potentate of all the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, this Darius the Mede, is separate and distinct from one we'll look at in just a few minutes in the book of Zechariah. The second Darius was actually the grandson of King Cyrus and was called Darius the Great, or Darius the Persian. If you would like to explore this topic of the 3 Ahasueruses and the 3 Dariuses, that is, if you have days and days and you're a glutton for punishment, LOL, I wrote about this topic in 2020 in my blog, and the name of the post is Esther 1, Ahasuerus and Vashti. I studied this topic for several days, and I'm still not 100% sure I got all 6 of these figures straight. However, even the historians and the experts don't agree. So let's move on. Okay, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole today, right? You would probably fire me as your Bible teacher. All right, so Darius the Mede put into place a governing structure, and he put Daniel into a position whereby he was in authority over 40 of the 120 satraps or viceroys, the regional rulers. You divide 120 by the 3 governors and you get 40, right? I'm not great at math, but even I can do that much, right? Verse 3. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and viceroys because an excellent spirit was in him. And the sovereign planned to appoint him over all the reign. Then the governors and viceroys sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the reign. But they were unable to find occasion or corruption because he was steadfast, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel concerning the reign," but they were unable to find occasion or corruption because he was steadfast and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his Elah," which means his God. Verse 6, then these governors and viceroys tumultuously gathered before the, I lost my place, before the sovereign, and said this to him, Sovereign Darius, live forever. All the governors of the reign, the nobles and viceroys, the counselors and the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal decree and to make a strong interdict that whoever petitions any a law or man for 30 days, except you, O sovereign, is thrown into the den of lions. Now, O sovereign, establish the interdict and sign the writing so that it is not to be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not pass away. So sovereign Darius signed the written interdict. And Daniel, when he knew the writing was signed, went home, and in his upper room, with his windows opened toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his Allah as he had done before. All of this is pretty understandable and in keeping with the jealousy of petty humans, i.e., the other leaders of the realm, and the pride of men with absolute power, i.e., kings. But let's look at verse 10 a little more closely. Daniel knew that since the king had signed this edict and that it could not be revoked by any human means, he knew that he had no chance with man to get this overturned. So he did not even attempt that. What did he do? He did not appeal to any human authority. Instead, he went into his closet and he appealed to heaven. He appealed to his God. His name, by the way, in Hebrew means God is my judge. Dani El. El means God. Dani, my judge. Daniel was asking God to advocate for him because he realized that God is the ultimate judge of all. Verse 10 also shows us that Daniel was a very devout follower of Father Yahweh, specifically in his prayer habits. Today, observant Jews and some Messianic believers pray 3 times a day. This is a Sephardic prayer book, a Sephardic Siddur. The Siddur is the book of prayers and blessings that observant Jews read from on a daily basis, on holidays, at the synagogue, whatever. But there are 3 times a day that prayers were said in the temple: the morning, midday, and as the day was waning in the evening. And you'll find sections on prayers for various occasions as well, such as prayers for the sick, prayers for when a baby is circumcised, and so on and so forth. It's just a comprehensive book of blessings and prayers that observant Jews use. I noticed when I watched the movie The Chosen recently that when the group of disciples were getting ready to go into their tents and bed down for the evening, they were reciting scripture. And what they were reciting was part of what's known as the bedtime Shema. It's part of prayers that are said when one is going to bed for the night. I thought that was pretty cool. All right. Did Daniel institute this tradition of praying 3 times a day? Well, it's hard to say, but the practice of praying 3 times a day was instituted formally by the prophet Ezra, who was a contemporary of Daniel, although Ezra was a bit younger, and who may have patterned this after Daniel's wonderful example. But moving on, these evil men discovered Daniel praying, as was his habit, and they ran tattling to the king. The king was greatly displeased with himself because he realized he had been had. He looked in vain for some way to deliver Daniel from the consequences of his having broken the king's ill-conceived edict. But there was no alternative, according to Persian law, but to toss him into the den of ferocious lions. Let's pick up with verse 16, where King Darius actually speaks prophetically. Then the sovereign gave orders, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the den of lions. But the sovereign spoke and said to Daniel, "Your Elah, whom you serve continually, he himself delivers you." Wow. Aren't you just amazed at how God can have truth flow, even prophecy, flow from the mouths of both of these pagan kings, Nebuchadnezzar, who correctly pegged the Malach Yahweh, and Darius the Mede. Wow. Verse 17, and a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the sovereign sealed it with his own signet, his own ring, and with the signets of his great men, that the situation concerning Daniel might not be changed. And the sovereign went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the sovereign rose up very early in the morning and hurried to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he called with a grieved voice to Daniel. The sovereign spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living Elah, has your Elah, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the sovereign, "O king, live forever. My Elah has sent his messenger and has shut the lions' mouths, and they did not harm me, because I was found innocent before him, and also before you, O sovereign, I have done no harm." And there we have our appearance of the Malach Yahweh, although we are reading about it in the past tense. While the king fasted and grieved and failed to sleep, God's messenger showed up and shut the mouths of the lions. Elsewhere, when messengers show up in the book of Daniel, the messengers are named. Gabriel is one, for example. But in Daniel 3 and in Daniel 6, the messenger both times is not named, other than the angel of God. Other angels can deliver prophetic messages and they can show visions, but only the Son of Yah, the Son of El, the Son of God, the Malach Yahweh, can deliver from death, showing this act to be even more miraculous is the information in verse 24. And the sovereign gave orders, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they threw them, their children, and their wives into the den of lions. And the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they even reached the floor of the den. Wow. Did King Darius become a believer in the God of Daniel? I don't know, but his testimony in the last verses of this chapter are marvelous. Verse 25. Then sovereign Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace be increased to you. From before me is made a decree that throughout every rule of my reign, men are to tremble and fear before the Elah of Daniel, for he is the living Elah and steadfast forever, and his reign is one which is not destroyed, and his rule is unto the end. He delivers and he rescues, and he works signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. For he has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. What an affirmation. I pray it was also his personal statement of faith. And you know what? When nations live this way, they do have peace increased to them. Does this story of Daniel remind you of any other Bible story? I see some parallels between this story and that of the resurrection of Jesus, the resurrection of Yeshua. Number one, Daniel, like Yeshua, was an upright man of God who was falsely accused by the rulers of his day and condemned to death. Now, of course, Yeshua was in a league of his own, but number two, a stone was rolled across the mouth of the den as one was rolled across the mouth of Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, where Yeshua's body lay for 3 days. Number three, a miracle occurred while people were sleeping. Darius was trying to, and the guards at the tomb slept. Both miracles were deliverances from death, in a manner of speaking. Of course, Yeshua's was from literal death, and Daniel's was a deliverance from almost certain death. Number four, in both cases, someone rose very early in the morning and hurried to the scene. Darius the Mede in Daniel's case, the women and later the disciples in Yeshua's case. And in both cases, the consequences were world-changing. Remember, the Medo-Persian Empire covered an area of over 1,500 miles. It extended from Egypt, including Egypt, all the way to include India. It was massive, massive. And when Darius made that edict to essentially make the faith of Daniel the faith of the realm, it was a preview of what we're going to have in the last days when Yeshua rules as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The entire world will have one faith, one religion. We will be one faith. We will be one people, and it will be the culmination that Father Yahweh began in Genesis 1:1. It will be one complete story, and its crowning jewel will be the redemption provided to us through our Mashiach, Yeshua. All right, we're going to move on now to appearance number 26, our last appearance. And yes, with this being seen, remember we talked about how God is omnipresent. He's everywhere. And so it's not like he came somewhere. He was there already. He just pulled back the curtain and revealed himself. So these are actually being scenes. But with being seen number 26, our series is done. However, of all our visits to these stories, this one is the most spread out. We're going to end by looking at the first 6 chapters of the book of Zechariah. We're not going to read all 6 chapters. I know you're grateful for that. But we'll instead be hopping and jumping through this extended vision. I think a vision that lasts for 6 chapters qualifies for being labeled extended, don't you? So if you'll turn to the book of Zechariah, if you're not already there, you can hop along with me. In an earlier appearance, the Malach Yahweh had to be restrained by Father Yahweh from destroying Jerusalem. In this vision of Zechariah's, the Malach Yahweh had appeared as he frequently did as a man, this time standing among a grove of myrtle trees. And then Zechariah in verses 12 and 13, we find a conversation between the Malach Yahweh and Father Yahweh, where the Malach Yahweh appeals to the Father on behalf of Jerusalem. Verse 12. And the messenger of Yahweh, that's the Malach Yahweh, answered and said, O Yahweh of angel armies, O Yahweh of hosts, how long would you have no compassion on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah, against which you were enraged these 70 years? And Yahweh answered the messenger who talked to me, good words, comforting words. Doesn't our Father Yahweh delight in giving good words, comforting words? This phrase reminds me of the term good news, gospel, the best news of all, actually. All right, moving on to chapter 2, the vision continues. Zechariah sees a man, spoiler alert, it's the Malach Yahweh, who has a measuring line in his hand. And this manifestation of the divine majestic mystery is going to measure the city of Jerusalem. Shortly, a second messenger appears who delivers a message to Zechariah from the Malach Yahweh. So while the Malach Yahweh is measuring the city of Jerusalem, he tells this second messenger to deliver a message to Zechariah. All right. And we know that the first messenger in these verses here, these verses in chapter 2, is the Malach Yahweh because he speaks for Father Yahweh directly. And there's another scene of measuring Jerusalem in the Bible, and that is found in Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. This prophetic passage in Revelation gives key information about the timeline of the last days, and it's a direct link back to Zechariah. Also, before we leave chapter 2, did you catch the language of the Malach Yahweh's words in verse 5 of chapter 2? He said, for I myself am to her, declares Yahweh, a wall of fire all around, and for a steam I am in her midst. Does this language remind you of a previous appearance of the Malach Yahweh? Yes, the burning bush, in which the holy fire was all around the bush, and within it, Jerusalem will be filled with the glory of the Lord, much as the bush was filled with holy fire. Moving on to chapter 3, we're having to hurry here. In chapter 3 of Zechariah, we will focus on the first 10 verses. That's actually the entire chapter. Here, Zechariah sees in his vision one of his contemporaries, Joshua the high priest. Now, in Hebrew, Joshua's name is pronounced Yehoshua. Here are the verses. We're going to read them all because, number one, because they are so fantastical, and because, number two, they are so little studied. I'm telling you right now, this chapter blew my mind. Are you ready? Here we go. And he showed me Yehoshua, the high priest, standing before the messenger of Yahweh, and Satan standing at his right hand to be an adversary to him. And Yahweh said to Satan, Yahweh rebuke you, Satan. Yahweh, who has chosen Jerusalem, rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire? And Yehoshua was dressed in filthy garments and was standing before the messenger. And he answered and spoke to those who stood before him, saying, remove the filthy garments from him. And to him he said, see, I have removed your guilt from you, and shall put costly robes on you. And I said, let them put a clean turban on his head. Then they put a clean turban on his head, and they put garments on him. And the messenger of Yahweh stood by. And the messenger of Yahweh witnessed to Yehoshua, saying, thus said Yahweh of hosts, if you walk in my ways, and if you guard my duty, then you shall also rule my house, and also guard my courts. And I shall give you access among these standing here. Now listen, Yehoshua, the high priest, you and your companions who sit before you, for they are men of symbol. For look, I am bringing forth my servant, the branch. See the stone which I have put before Yehoshua? On one stone are 7 eyes. See, I am engraving its inscription, declares Yahweh of hosts, and I shall remove the guilt of that land in one day. In that day, declares Yahweh of hosts, you shall invite one another under the vine and under the fig tree. There's so much I want to say about this chapter, so much, but for the sake of time, I will have to content myself with telling you about this little known man, Yehoshua or Joshua. This is not the Joshua of the book of Joshua and Judah and Judges, who was on the scene over 800 years before this Yehoshua. This man, Yehoshua ben Jehozadak, was one of the first Hebrews to return to the land of Judah after the Babylonian captivity ended. He went in the first wave of refugees to return. They left Yehuda, they left Judah in 3 waves, and they returned in 3 waves. Joshua, Yehoshua was in the first wave. He was of the tribe of Levi, yet he was born in Babylon. His father had been the last high priest before Babylon destroyed the temple of Solomon. Haggai wrote about this Yehoshua in Haggai 1:1, and he's also mentioned in Ezra chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, where we find him helping to rebuild the temple. In his role as high priest, Yehoshua worked hand in hand with Zerubbabel, who was the appointed governor over Yehuda at the time of the return. Joshua served in this high priest capacity until Ezra came along in the second wave of returnees to serve in that role. The scene Zechariah witnessed, this scene in the throne room of God, is amazing to me. Did Zechariah witness this and then tell Joshua, his contemporary, about it? Was Joshua, Yehoshua actually there in the vision with Zechariah, seeing and experiencing the vision also? I don't know. The scriptures do not say. They don't indicate which of these interpretations might be correct. But regardless, how humbling and flabbergasting for any mere human being to be considered so crucial to the plan of God that he appeared before God's throne and was opposed by Hasatan, by Satan, in the presence of the Malach Yahweh and in the presence of Father Yahweh himself. Then Father Yahweh effectively dismissed the accuser. Good riddance. Bye. This Yehoshua, also called Yeshua in some translations, was already the high priest. Hang on, it gets better. Yet here in this vision, he's being crowned with a priestly turban and clothed with priestly robes. So here he typifies an anointed high priest. But there's more. When we reach chapter 6, this man's story is not done. Okay, we must hurry to chapter 4. I have less than 15 minutes. We've got to really move. In chapter 4, we see the messenger waking a sleeping Zechariah and giving him a vision of two menorahs a vision of menorahs and two olive trees. When Zechariah asked the Malach Yahweh the meaning of these symbols, the messenger speaks some of the most famous words from the book of Zechariah. They're in chapter 4, verse 6. Quote, "Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, said Yahweh of hosts." End quote, and amen to that. We won't stay in chapter 5, but for a brief touchdown, our plane will barely graze the runway. The messenger showed Zechariah a vision of a flying Torah scroll and two flying women. Messengers appearing in female form, perhaps? Now to chapter 6, and this will blow your socks off. If chapter 3 amazed you, just hang on to your copy of the scriptures. Are you ready? Here we go. We're going to link back to chapter 3. I know it feels like we're going backward, but we're not. In verses 11 through 13, Zechariah receives from the messenger a word from Father Yahweh, and it is amazing. I'm reverting to the Amplified Bible translation now for the sake of clarity. Verse 11. Take silver and gold from them and make an ornate crown. Now this is talking about, again, Yehoshua. Make an ornate crown and set it on the head of Yehoshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Then say to Yehoshua, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, look, keep in sight, watch, a man, Mashiach, Messiah, whose name is Branch, for he shall branch out from his place, Israel, the Davidic line, and he shall build the ultimate temple of the Lord. Yes, you are to build the temple of the Lord, but it is he who shall build the ultimate temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the honor and majesty as the only begotten of the Father, and sit and rule on his throne, and he shall be a priest on his throne, and the council of priests shall be between the two offices, priest and king. End quote. In this prophetic vision, Zechariah was shown that Yehoshua and Yeshua were linked, in that Yehoshua was a type for the Mashiach, the Messiah, the branch to come. Branch is exclusively a messianic title, as evidenced in Isaiah 11, verses 1 through 2, and Jeremiah 23, verses 5 and 6. The names Joshua, Yehoshua, and Yeshua share the same three Hebrew consonants in the same order. Only the vowels are different, making Yehoshua a longer form. Yehoshua or Yehoshua, Yeshua or Yeshua, depending on whether you pronounce the Hebrew or the Aramaic. The ordination and later coronation pictured in Zechariah 3 and Zechariah 6 were to serve as an encouragement to Yehoshua in his work of rebuilding the temple. So again, in chapter 3, we see Yehoshua being robed and clothed as high priest. In chapter 6, we see him being crowned as a king. Also, it was a visual prophecy of the future Messiah who would be both high priest, Hebrews 6:20, and king, Matthew 27:11. One Yehoshua rebuilt the temple of Solomon. The ultimate Yehoshua surpassed it. Zechariah not only prophesied about Messiah, he announced his very name, Yeshua, Jesus. And thus, we have completed our study of the 26 appearances, the 26 being scenes of the Son of God, our Mashiach, in the Tanakh. These began before man was created, but after that, they literally run from Abraham, to Zechariah, literally from A to Z. Glory to the Lord. You know, in that last appearance, I have a friend who is, he calls himself a Nazarene, which is a name that was applied to the first Jewish believers in Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. But you might call him a messianic in a broader sense. But this friend of mine testifies that he was born and raised a Jew. But when he really studied Zechariah 6 and he realized what it was saying, he fell to his knees and he accepted Yeshua as his Mashiach. He accepted Jesus as his Messiah. That's how powerful Zechariah 6 is. And I have to tell you, I had heard that Joshua was a type of the Messiah. I always thought they were talking about the Joshua who succeeded Moses, the Joshua of the books of the Torah and the books of Joshua and who died at the end of the book of Joshua. I had always thought that's the Joshua they were talking about. But even though it may have been to some extent, this Joshua, this Yehoshua in Zechariah 3 and 6, this one, oh my goodness. When I studied this, it just blew my mind. Well, I thank you for studying along with me. And I know you're wondering, well, Gena, what's next? What are we going to study next? Well, that will have to remain a secret because even though we're going to start it next week, I'll be honest with you, I'm still praying about that. I have some things in mind, but I haven't quite settled in my spirit what those are going to be. So just stay tuned. Next week, we will begin something new. It'll probably be a rather short series. It won't be 7 installments long as this one was, but it'll probably be a short series. But regardless, I look forward to seeing you back here at Mishkan Katan. And until then, I wish you all the best. And I say shalom, shalom, lehitraot.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.